The hollow throne of the Sale dynasty was not a building so much as a verdict rendered in stone, a vertical wound carved 40 meters down into the bedrock of a world that had never once apologized for its cruelty. Its walls were a single, seamless pour of black, vitrified rock, polished until they returned every torch as a smear of cold blue, and its ceiling vanished upward into a darkness that no lamp had ever fully reached. Sound did strange things in that chamber. A whisper at the base of the dais carried to the topmost gallery with perfect clarity, while a scream at the gallery rail arrived at the throne as nothing at all, swallowed by the geometry of a room built to make the powerless feel their own smallness in their teeth. The Saleth had ruled the three inner systems for 900 standard years from this throat of rock, and every petitioner who had ever knelt on its frozen floor understood the same thing the architecture was designed to teach. Mercy here was not a rite. It was a weather pattern, occasional and unpredictable, and it could be revoked the instant the sky decided otherwise. Into this chamber, on a morning the court calendar marked as ordinary, came a single human, unarmed, ungloved, and entirely unimpressed by the cold. He was not what the room had been built to break, and that was the first of many things the room did not yet know. His name was Daroven, and the official transmission that had preceded him to the Saleth court described him as a logistics liaison of the Terran Conquered, third class, a designation so deliberately unremarkable that it functioned as a kind of camouflage. He was 34 standard years old. He stood at a height the Saleth found faintly comical, the top of his head reaching only to the collarbone of the shortest courtier, and he carried himself with the loose, unhurried economy of a man who had spent his life lifting heavy things in dangerous places and had learned exactly how much effort each motion required. He did not stride. He did not posture. He walked the long approach to the dais the way a man walks across a yard he has crossed 10,000 times, looking at the floor, the walls, the seams in the stone, cataloging, and the courtiers who watched him from the dim galleries mistook his attention for the gawping of a primitive. They were wrong, but they had no framework yet to understand how wrong, and the room gave them no reason to doubt themselves. The Saleth were a tall people, averaging well over 2 meters, with skin the pale, luminous blue of deep ice and a faint internal bioluminescence that pulsed at the throat and wrists when they felt strongly and could not afford to show it. Their eyes were large and silver and lidless, protected instead by a clear nictitating membrane that swept sideways, and they read the world through a sense humans did not possess, a fine perception of electrical fields that let them feel the heartbeat of anyone within 4 meters as plainly as a human might feel sunlight on skin. This was the foundation of Saleth power. They could not be lied to in person. The flutter of a guilty pulse, the spike of fear, the telltale acceleration of deceit, all of it was visible to them, and so they had built 9 centuries of dominion on the simple, devastating fact that no one could stand before a Saleth and conceal a frightened heart. It made their courts honest in the way a torture chamber is honest. It made their enemies tremble. And it meant that the single most disorienting thing in their 900-year history was now walking toward the throne with a heartbeat as steady and slow as a sleeping animal's, betraying nothing, because there was nothing in the man to betray. On the throne sat Queen Irena Sael, 9th of her line, and she was the reason the chamber had been carved to swallow screams. She was old by the measure of her species, which meant she had reigned for 200 years and intended to reign for 200 more, and her bioluminescence had long since dimmed to a controlled ember at the base of her throat. A sign not of weakness, but of a discipline so total that she had trained herself to feel almost nothing the room could read. She governed through a single instrument, fear, applied with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a glacier. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. When Queen Irene spoke, the galleries leaned in, because the only thing more dangerous than hearing her was missing a word. And on this ordinary morning she was speaking to the assembled court about the human delegation and the terms under which the conquered would be permitted to operate a single supply depot at the edge of Salith space. She was, the court records would later note, precisely in the middle of a sentence about the limits of conquered ambition when the morning stopped being ordinary. To understand what happened next, the chamber needed to understand who else stood on the dais, and the court understood them very well. At the queen's right hand stood Vael Solen, mistress of the Inner Watch, the second most feared Salith alive. She was tall even by the standards of her people, her skin a darker gray-blue marbled with old bioluminescent scars, and she had spent 40 years learning to read not just the heartbeat, but the micro-tremor of intent that preceded an act. She had unmasked 9 conspiracies and ended 9 bloodlines, and she watched the human approach with the flat, patient attention of a predator who had already decided the outcome and was merely waiting for the prey to confirm it. To the queen's left stood Counselor Hesk, keeper of the treasury and the trade ledgers, a thin, pale figure whose throat light had a habit of flickering when the conversation turned to numbers, a tell that Vol had noted years ago and filed away without comment, because in the Salith court, information was a currency one spent only when the exchange rate was favorable. And at the foot of the throne, half hidden in the folds of the queen's formal robe, sat a child. Her name was Niska, and she was the queen's youngest daughter, 4 years old by human reckoning, which among the Salith was an age of frantic electrical noise when a child's perception of fields ran wild and unfiltered, and the world arrived as an overwhelming roar of every nearby heartbeat at once. Salith children of that age were kept apart, swaddled in dampening cloth, because the chaos of an adult court was physically painful to a nervous system that had not yet learned to filter. But Niska was the queen's daughter, and the queen believed a royal child should learn to endure the throne early, and so the girl sat at her mother's feet in a dampening shawl, small and luminous and silent, her throat light stuttering in a pattern that any Salith physician would have recognized as distress, and that every adult in the room had been trained from birth to ignore. The court did not look at the child. The court looked at the queen, and the queen, mid-sentence, did not look at the child either. Darrow stopped at the mark inlaid in the floor, the precise spot where petitioners were required to halt, and he inclined his head the exact measured amount that protocol demanded, no more and no less, because he had read the protocol on the voyage in and had decided that getting it exactly right was a form of respect that cost him nothing and bought him room. The queen's silver eyes moved over him, and Val's moved over him, and both of them registered the same impossible reading at the same instant. The human's heart was slow. Not slowed by drugs, not the false calm of a sedative, which the watch knew the signature of, but genuinely, restfully slow. The heartbeat of a creature that did not understand it stood in a place designed to kill it. Vile's first private assessment, recorded in the throat-light flicker only another Salith could read, was contempt. The human was an idiot. He did not feel the danger because he was too primitive to perceive it. This assessment would last exactly 11 minutes, and Vial would spend the rest of her life recalculating from the moment it shattered. The Queen resumed her sentence. She was a creature of total control, and a primitive's arrival did not derail her, and she continued explaining to the court and to the human delegation the precise boundaries within which the conquered would be tolerated, her voice low and even, the galleries leaning in. And as she spoke, 3 things happened in sequence. None of them loud. All of them watched only by the man who watched everything. The first was that Counselor Hesk's throat light flickered. It flickered when the Queen mentioned the depot's projected supply volumes, a small, stuttering pulse that he suppressed almost instantly, and Vial saw it and filed it. And the Queen, focused on her sentence, did not. Darrow saw it too, though he could not read its meaning the way a Salith could. He simply noticed that the thin, pale one had twitched at a number, the way a man twitches when a card he did not expect lands on the table, and he added it to the inventory in his head without changing his expression by a single degree. The second was that the child's distress deepened. Niska's small throat light, half hidden in the robe, accelerated into a fast, irregular flutter, and her tiny hands had begun to press flat against the stone floor, and her large, silver eyes had gone wide and fixed in the particular blankness that in a human child would have been recognized in an instant as the prelude to a sensory overload. A small body about to be overwhelmed by a flood, it could not stop. No Salith adult in that room recognized it, because their training had taught them that a royal child's discomfort was beneath notice, and that the dais was the safest place in 3 systems. They were experts in fields and currents, and the heartbeat of intent. They were strangers to the simple animal fact of a frightened small thing. The third thing that happened was that Darrow Venn broke protocol. He did it without drama, without a word, in a single fluid motion that the galleries would replay in argument for years. He took 3 steps off the petitioner's mark, crossed the forbidden distance to the foot of the dais, and lowered himself into a crouch beside the Queen's daughter, putting his own warm, slow, steady heart within the 4-meter radius of the child's senses, and then within 1 meter, and then within reach. To every Salith in the room, this was an act of insane aggression, an unarmed primitive lunging toward the air at the foot of the throne, and Vial Solenne moved, her hand going to the resonance blade at her hip, her own throat light flaring white, with the spike of a predator committing to a kill. The Queen stopped speaking. The chamber, which had been built to swallow sound, found a silence even it could not have engineered, and the child climbed into the human's lap. She did it the way a drowning creature climbs toward air, scrambling out of the robe and across the freezing stone and up into the warm, steady thing that had come close. And she pressed her small, luminous face against his chest, against the slow, loud, certain drum of a human heart, and the flood that had been about to break over her broke instead against that steady rhythm and dispersed. Her throat light, which had been stuttering toward white panic, dimmed in 3 seconds to a soft, even pulse. Her hand stopped pressing the stone. Her breathing slowed to match the heartbeat she had pressed herself against, because that was what the heartbeat was for. That was the thing every human infant learns before it learns anything else, that there is a sound in the center of another body that means safe, and the man had simply offered it, the way he would have offered it to any frightened small thing, without calculation, because to him it was not a political act but a law of physics as plain as the cold. For 3 excruciating seconds, absolute silence reigned. Vial's blade was half drawn. The queen's hand had risen from the throne's arm. Every silver eye in the room was fixed on the impossible image at the foot of the dais. A human air thief, a child who should have been screaming, and the soft, synchronized pulse of 2 hearts that had no business beating in time. And then, Vial Solana, who could read the field of any creature within 4 meters, read the child's. There was no fear in it. The terror that had been climbing toward a seizure was simply gone, drained out of the small body, and replaced by the slow, even calm of the heartbeat she rested against. The watch mistress had spent 40 years learning that a frightened heart could not be faked, and that calm under threat was the rarest and most dangerous thing a creature could possess. She looked at the child, resting against the primitive's chest, at the terror that had vanished, and her contempt died in her throat and was replaced by the first cold pinprick of a new and far more disturbing assessment. The human was not an idiot. The human had seen something every trained adult in the room had missed, and he had crossed a death line to fix it, and his heart had not changed its rhythm by a single beat the entire time. Vial slid her blade back into its sheath. It was the loudest sound in the chamber. The queen looked at her daughter, and for the first time in the memory of the court, her throat light betrayed her, a single involuntary pulse of something that was not fear and was not anger, and she mastered it in half a beat, and her face went smooth again. But Vial had seen it, and Hesk had seen it, and a thing had shifted on the dais that the architecture had no power to swallow. Queen Irene Sile, 9th of her line, looked at the human holding her child, and she finished her interrupted sentence, but she finished it to a room that was no longer listening, because the room was looking at the child, and the room had stopped. What the court did not know, what only Counselor Hesk and one other knew, was that the morning had never been ordinary at all. The supply depot the queen was negotiating was not a depot. The volumes Hesk's throatlight had flickered at were not supply volumes. 3 years earlier, when the Salith treasury had run thin from a border war the court did not discuss, Hesk had quietly begun selling Salith perception technology, the field reading sensor arrays that were the foundation of the dynasty's power, to a Concord splinter faction through a chain of intermediaries so long that no single link could see the whole. The depot was the next link. Its true cargo would be the sensors, and its true purpose would be to put the one weapon the Salith had against the rest of the galaxy into the hands of people who would copy it. And Hesk's flickering throat light at the mention of volumes was the flicker of a man watching his treason approach completion. He had arranged for a human liaison, 3rd class, unremarkable, to handle the logistics precisely because a primitive who could not read fields would never notice what was being shipped. He had chosen Darrow Venn off a roster for his very ordinariness, and he had just watched that ordinary man cross a forbidden line, see what no Salith had seen, and earn in 11 minutes the personal attention of both the queen and the mistress of the inner watch. Hesk's throat light flickered again, and this time it was fear. And this time, Vial, distracted by the child, did not see it. But the audience did. The trap that had been built around the human was about to become a trap around the man who built it, and only the man who built it knew it yet. In the days that followed, Darrow was not expelled, which surprised the court, and was not executed, which surprised the court more. The queen issued a single instruction through her steward that the human liaison would remain at court to complete the depot arrangements, and that he would be quartered in the lower residence wing, and that the child Niska would be permitted to spend a portion of each day in the human's company, because the royal physicians, summoned at last to examine a heir whose sensory storms had for years been dismissed, had confirmed what the human had stumbled onto by instinct. The child's developing field sense was hypersensitive, a flaw the Salith considered shameful and concealed, and the chaotic roar of nearby heartbeats genuinely injured her. And the one thing that had ever calmed her was the slow, steady, untroubled rhythm of a heart that felt no fear. There was no such heart among the Salith. Every adult in 3 systems carried the low, constant hum of a creature that lived in a court of predators. Only the human was quiet inside. Only the human was safe to sit beside. The queen, who loved her daughter in the cold-buried way that 200 years of rule had left her capable of, made a calculation. And the calculation was that her child's only relief was a primitive she did not trust, and she resolved to use him and watch him and learn what he was. And the resolution was, in its own glacial way, the beginning of something she had not felt in a long time. Darrow completed the depot arrangements during the days and sat with the child during the afternoons, and he did the second thing the way he did everything, without performance. He did not coo at her or perform affection. He let her climb onto his lap and press against his chest while he worked through manifests on a battered slate, and he talked to her in a low, even voice about whatever was in front of him, the weights of containers and the tolerances of seals and the names of the stars the depot would serve. And she did not understand a word and did not need to, because the words were not the point. The heartbeat was the point. The court physicians monitored these sessions through the wall, and what they recorded baffled them. The child's field sense was not merely calming in the human's presence, it was developing. The constant exposure to a single, steady, safe rhythm was teaching her overwhelmed nervous system to filter, to find one signal in the noise and hold to it, the way a swimmer learns to find the surface. The flaw the dynasty had hidden in shame was, with the right anchor, becoming a discipline. The human was, without being asked and without seeming to notice, repairing the air. Valselena watched all of it. She had appointed herself the human's shadow, telling the queen it was a security measure, and telling herself it was vigilance, and she watched Darrow Ven the way she had once watched the 9 conspirators, whose bloodlines she had ended, looking for the tell, the flicker, the moment the mask slipped, and the true, frightened, self-interested creature showed itself. The moment never came. She watched him refuse a bribe from a minor courtier without changing expression. She watched him work 11-hour days on the depot manifests, and then sit with the child as though the child were the day's only real task. She watched him, one freezing night when the residence heating failed, take apart the ancient resonance coil that warmed the wing, a device Salith engineers maintained with ritual reverence, and Darrow had never seen before. The wing had gone cold in the second hour past midnight, the kind of cold that crept up through the vitrified floor and into the marrow, and the courtiers in the lower residence had wrapped themselves in dampening cloth and waited for the morning engineers the way the Salith waited for everything, with a stillness that was half discipline and half resignation. Darrow did not wait. He found the coil housing by following the dead cold air to its source, a recessed alcove behind a panel that opened only to a sequence. He watched a passing steward enter and remembered, and he crouched before the silent device and looked at it the way he looked at everything, reading the seams, finding the place where the old machine had failed. A resonance node had cracked. Hairline, The kind of fault that a Salith engineer would have diagnosed by feel and replaced with a foundry part over the course of a reverent half-day. Darrow did not have a foundry part. He had a manifest clip, a thin strip of conductive alloy, and he bent it and scored it and worked it into a bridge across the cracked node with the unhurried patience of a man who had spent his childhood making broken things work because there was no money for new ones. And in 40 minutes, the coil woke, and a low warmth bled back into the floor, and the wing, full of sleeping courtiers, stirred and settled, and never knew their warmth that night had a human source. He wiped the alloy dust from his hands on his trousers and went back to bed. He did not mention it in the morning. File had watched him do it through the doorway, motionless in the dark, and she had waited for him to mention it, to bank the favor, to let it slip to a steward or a courtier that the human had warmed them all while they slept, to spend the currency the way every creature in that court spent every kindness it ever performed. He never did, and her recalibration deepened into something that was no longer assessment and had begun against 40 years of training to resemble respect. She brought him a cup once in the 3rd week. It was a small thing, a vessel of the hot, bitter stimulant the watch drank on the long postings, and she set it beside his slate without a word and did not meet his eyes and walked away before he could acknowledge it. Because acknowledgement would have made it a transaction, and she did not want a transaction. Darrow drank it. He understood it for what it was, the way he understood most things, and he understood that the wrong response would ruin it. And so he said nothing, and the next morning he left a cup of the same stimulant, made the human way with the measure of sweetness she did not expect, and found she did not dislike, on the rail outside the watch station, and walked away before she arrived. The cup traveled back and forth between them for the rest of his time at court, a small, warm object passing through the hands of the 2 most controlled people in 3 systems, and neither of them ever once said a word about what it was, because they both knew that saying it would break it, and some things are too important to risk on speech. The discovery came in the 4th week, and it came because the child had learned to filter. Niska, sitting on the human's lap while he reconciled the final depot manifest, had begun for the first time in her life to perceive individual fields cleanly through the noise, and she had begun, in the way of children, to comment on them. She told the human, in the broken half-language of a 4-year-old, that the thin pale one's light went funny when he talked about the boxes. She did not know what it meant. She only knew that Counselor Hesk's throat light flickered every time the manifest discussed the sealed containers in the depot's 3rd bay, the ones marked as agricultural sensors, and she said so, pressing her small face against the human's chest, the way she reported everything she saw now that she could see, because the human was the safe one, and you told the safe one everything. Darrow went very still. He looked at the manifest. He looked at the 3rd bay containers, the agricultural sensors, and he thought about a thin, pale courtier whose light went funny at a number weeks ago on his first morning in the chamber, and he thought about the fact that he had been chosen for this posting precisely because he could not read what these people could read, and a slow, cold understanding assembled itself in his mind the way a structure assembles when the last beam drops into place. He did not say anything to anyone. This was the thing the court would never fully understand about him, that he did not rush to power with what he knew, did not seek out the queen to trade his discovery for safety or advantage. He had grown up on a salvage flat where information given away too soon was information stolen, and where the people who survived were the ones who learned the whole shape of a thing before they let anyone see they were looking at it. So he kept his face on the slate and his voice on the manifest, and he asked the child, in the same low, even tone he used for the weights of containers, whether the thin, pale one's light had gone funny at any other boxes. And the girl considered the question with the grave concentration of the very young, and told him no, only the ones in the third bay, only the agricultural ones, and went back to tracing the seams of his sleeve with one small luminous finger. He filed that. He simply pulled the third bay manifest and read it the way he read everything, line by line, looking not at what the numbers claimed to be, but at what they could not lie about. And he found that the agricultural sensors were specified at a mass and a power draw, and a shielding tolerance that no agricultural sensor had ever required. Farm sensors did not need to be wrapped in graded superconducting shroud. Farm sensors did not draw a trickle current to keep a core from cooling below a threshold in transit. He had handled 10,000 cargo manifests in his life, and he knew the signature of a lie told in specifications, the way a number sat a little too precise, a little too engineered for the humble thing it claimed to describe. And the shielding tolerance was exactly, precisely, the tolerance required to transport a Salith field perception array without degrading it, a fact he knew only because he had spent 4 weeks among people whose entire civilization ran on those arrays and had, in his quiet cataloging way, learned what they were and what they needed, learned it from a child who told him everything she saw, and from the engineers who maintained the resonance coil, and from the simple act of paying attention in a place where everyone assumed he could not. The boxes marked as farm equipment were the eyes of the dynasty, packed for shipment to people who should never have them. And the man who had signed the shipping order was the man whose light went funny at numbers. What Darrow did then was the most dangerous thing he did in his entire time at court, and he did it without changing his heartbeat. He finished the manifest. He completed the depot arrangements exactly as specified, signed off on the third bay containers without a flicker of objection. And he did it because he understood that the only way to catch a thing like this was to let it believe it was safe, and that the instant Hesk suspected discovery, the containers would vanish and the trail would burn. He played the part of the unremarkable primitive who noticed nothing, the part Hesk had cast him in, and he played it perfectly, because the part required exactly the thing he had in abundance, a heart that gave nothing away. And then, when the manifest was complete, and the shipment was scheduled and Hesk's treason was committed to a specific cargo in a specific bay on a specific day, Darrow made one move. He requested a private audience with the Queen on a matter of depot logistics, and in that audience, with no one present but the Queen and the child who would not leave his side, and Val Solene, who never left his shadow, he laid the third bay manifest on the table and said, in his low, even voice, that the Queen should look very carefully at what her court was shipping in the boxes marked as farm equipment, because where he came from, they made their living picking up broken things, and he had learned young that the most valuable thing in any pile of junk was always the thing somebody had taken the trouble to hide. The room stopped for the second time. Val read the manifest in 9 seconds, and her throat light flared white, not with the spike of a kill this time, but with the cold fury of a guardian who has found the breach she spent 40 years watching for in the one place she never thought to look. Inside the treasury, signed in a hand she knew. The Queen read it more slowly, and her face did not change, and her throat light did not change, because she was the Queen, and 200 years had taught her to receive a knife to the spine without moving, but her hand found her daughter's shoulder where the child sat against the human, and it rested there. And that was the only thing in the room that betrayed what the manifest meant to her. She understood it completely. She understood that her own counselor had been selling the foundation of her power for 3 years, that the depot was the delivery mechanism, that the human delegation had been chosen as unwitting couriers, and that the one person who had caught it was the primitive Hesk had selected precisely because he was supposed to be incapable of catching anything. She understood, too, the thing that made the Saleth court the cold place it was, which was that Hesk would have arranged protection, would have insulated himself, would have built the structure so that exposure of the cargo did not lead to exposure of the man. A frightened heart could be read in a Saleth. But Hesk had spent 3 years not being frightened in any room where a reader stood, because he had committed his treason on paper and through intermediaries, and never once in the presence of the watch. The proof was in the boxes, and the boxes did not implicate the man, and Hesk knew it. And that was why he had signed the order with such steadiness. It was Vial who closed the gap, and she closed it with the one thing Hesk had not accounted for. She had spent 4 weeks shadowing the human and learning, against all her training, to value a thing she had no word for. And in learning it, she had relearned how to watch. She did not go to Hesk and accuse him, which would have produced only a steady heart and an empty cargo bay by morning. She went to the depot, alone, the night before the shipment, and she examined the 3rd bay containers herself, and she found what Darrow had told her to look for: the small overlooked detail, the wrong serial number on a single shielding panel, a panel that had been swapped from a genuine Saleth array and still carried, etched in a place no one cleaning a manifest would think to scrub, the inventory mark of the Royal Sensor Foundry. The boxes were not merely shielded for arrays. They contained one, a test unit, shipped early to prove the chain worked. And the Royal Foundry's inventory system recorded every hand that had drawn a unit, and the hand that had drawn that one 3 years and 4 months ago was the hand of Counselor Hesk. He had protected the cargo, and protected the chain, and protected himself in every room a reader might stand. He had not thought to scrub a serial number from a panel because he was a man who read fields and had never in his life learned to look at the small, dumb, physical things, the seams, the marks, the broken pieces in the pile. He had built his entire defense on the assumption that no one in the Saleth court would think like a junk picker. He had been right about every Saleth in the court. He had not counted on the one who wasn't. Hesk's exposure, when it came quietly, in the manner of the Saleth court, which did not stage its reckonings for an audience. He was summoned, and the serial number was placed before him, and the foundry record beside it, and his throat light, which had survived 3 years of treason without a betraying flicker because he had never committed his crime in a reader's presence, finally flared in a private chamber before the only 2 readers who mattered, and the flare was a confession that no words were needed to complete. What happened to him afterward was Saleth business, resolved in a separate chamber on a separate day, and the human was not present for it and never asked, because the punishment of the antagonist was not the thing he had come for, and was never the thing he stayed for. He had stayed for the afternoons. The depot, when it finally opened, was a real depot, carrying real supplies, its 3rd base swept clean, and its manifests honest. And the Concord delegation that ran it never learned how close it had come to being the instrument that broke the Saleth, and through them, the fragile peace of 3 systems. Darrow's posting was extended, at the Queen's request, phrased as a matter of depot oversight, and understood by everyone involved as something else. He kept his quarters in the lower residence wing. He kept his afternoons, and the court, which had spent 900 years learning that the only safe posture before the throne was a controlled and frightened stillness, found itself slowly, against every instinct the architecture had been built to enforce, reorganizing around the disorienting presence of a small, warm creature who was not afraid and never had been. On a morning the court calendar marked as ordinary some months later, Queen Irene Sael sat upon the hollow throne and received a delegation, and she was speaking in her low, even voice about the boundaries of a new trade accord. The galleries leaning in. At the foot of the dais sat the human liaison, 3rd class, on a low stone seat that had appeared in the residence inventory without anyone signing for it, in the precise spot a petitioner was forbidden to occupy and that no one any longer thought to object to. And in his lap, filtering the roar of the chamber down to the single steady signal she had learned to find and hold, sat the Queen's youngest daughter, awake and calm, and watching the court with clear, untroubled silver eyes, reading the fields of 100 frightened adults without flinching, because she had learned where the quiet was, and she had learned that it would not leave. Violcelene stood at the Queen's right hand, and on the rail beside her station was a cup of the hot, bitter stimulant made the human way, with a measure of sweetness, and she had stopped pretending she did not know who left it. The Queen reached the middle of her sentence, and her silver eyes moved once, briefly, from the delegation to the foot of the dais, to the small, calm child, and the quiet man, and her throat light did not flicker, because she had nothing left to hide from the only 2 people in 3 systems who already knew exactly what she felt. She held the look for a half-beat longer than the sentence required. Then she finished the sentence, and the court listened, and no one, this time, thought it strange at all that the heir to the hollow throne should sleep so easily in a primitive's arms, at the foot of a throne built to teach the world that nowhere was safe, in the one place that finally was.